Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion Sessions. We're your hosts, Dr. Cameron Thompson and Mr. William Lassiter. And today we are going to be addressing the chapter I almost said Unchained Melody, the Unchaining of Melkor, or Feanor and the Righteous Brothers.
Feanor and the Righteous Brothers.
It's a short chapter in the Silmarillion, but it's really significant. It's really pivotal. It's a catalyst in many ways to everything that follows after. And before we get started with that, though, because it dives right into the narrative of Feanor's birth, his conception and birth, and how Melkor, well, according to the chapter, as we can tell from the chapter title, the Unchaining of Melkor. How does he get loose again? Didn't the Valar lock him up, previously? What happens there? But in order to understand that, we actually have to look at the previous chapter where there's the list of the princes of Eldamar. And we're told the names then of this family. And that's important to know because we're given the who's who in one chapter. And then we get a little bit of the story without reference necessarily to the relations in the next chapter. So I want to actually give us some framework, some context here, and then we'll begin our discussion of the Unchaining of Melkor. And that is this. So background, big picture background. We're in the Blessed Realm. And we have all three races of the elves are there. There's the Vanyar, they've gone and live in the house of the Valar. The Noldor are there, and the Teleri are there. Now, Teleri are kind of on their own island for the most part, and somewhat along the shores, trading back when they develop boats, right? They have boat craft, and they make boats and ships and all of that. Now, we're told a little bit about the Noldor, and this actually sets the scene. This is a few pages in the previous, backwards into the previous chapter. It says, the Noldor afterwards came back to Middle-earth, and this tale tells mostly of their deeds. Right? So in many ways, this is almost functioning as an introduction to the real plot of the Silmarillion proper. Therefore, the names and kinship of the Noldor princes may here be told in that form which the names later bore in the tongue of the elves of Beleriand, right? So we're going to be using their names as they later were known, as the language evolves, because we're talking thousands and thousands of years. Okay, so Finwë, take notes now at this point. This is because we got a lot of F names. It's like reading some of these old Gaelic, hero stories. Clear the relation between them. But Finwë is the king of the Noldor. Okay, so he's the king of the Noldor elves. Noldor is one tribe, if you will, or race of elves. There's the Teleri and the Vanyar, and we'll mostly be concerned with the Noldor and the Teleri. Finwë is the king of the Noldor. The sons of Finwë are Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin. Okay, so three sons: Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin. But the mother of Feanor was Miriel Serinde, which is Miriel, whereas the mother of Fingolfin and Finarfin was Indis of the Vanyar. So Feanor, and we'll see why that is in just a moment, but it's important to know because we're told the story. If we want to understand where the story's going, we need to know this fact. Finwë and Miriel had Feanor. Miriel dies. It's kind of the first elf to really die. They don't really know what to do with that, but that's a fact, and we'll see the story of that in a moment. And then Finwë remarries Indis, who's not a Noldor, she's Vanya, and they have Fingolfin and Finarfin. Okay, and so we'll understand them in a moment. And they're different, so they're half brothers of Feanor. And they have a sister. Well, we'll get into that here. Feanor. Now we're told about Feanor, and then we should then we'll go into the plot, because then we also get a little bit of the sons of Feanor, and it gets too many people. But Feanor, we're told, was the mightiest in skill of word and of hand, more learned than his brothers. His spirit burned as a flame. So Feanor was more learned than his brothers, and his spirit burned as a flame. And here's the interesting thing about the narrative that we're about to dive into, is his spirit from his very conception burned as a flame so much that his mother perished in bearing him. She was so exhausted and spent because he's like somehow he's like this burning ball of fire in some way. It was some spiritual way, not like literally fire, but somehow that took all her strength to create him and bear him forth. Fingolfin was the strongest, the most steadfast, and the most valiant. And Finarfin was the fairest, the most wise of heart. And afterwards, he was a friend of the sons of Olwe, Lord of the Teleri. Okay. And then we end up that there's other, you can see in the genealogy charts, who is somehow, their descendants become significant players later on, both in the Silmarillion and in Lord of the Rings. But these three, it's almost like you've got three knights of the round table being listed here. You've got the one who's crafty, he's learned, he's fiery. You've got another one who is the strongest, the steadfast, the valiant. And then Sir Finarfin, the most wise and kind of heart, fairest, that. They give all the characters, it's good to refer to. We'll refer to in genealogies as we go along, as these their sons and their sons' sons play a role in the story of the Silmarillion and the plot line. But Feanor is really interesting. I mean, he's the key figure here. He's the one who makes the Silmarils, and we get the story of his birth. Now, we're told his spirit burns as a fire, and so the setting of the scene. So now we move. This is the definitive move now from sort of lists of names and his basic histories, event and event and event set into a documentary sort of style, moving from that into actual narrative, right? So there's dialogue, but we've got more of a detailed plot. It's more at the tangible level, and it sets the scene. And it's like this chapter begins almost like a fairy tale, and I think that's what I love about this. It begins like a fairy tale. It says, now the three kindreds of the Eldar were gathered together at last in Valinor, and Melkor was chained. This was the noontide of the blessed realm, the fullness of its glory and its bliss, long in tale of years, but in memory too brief. It's another way of saying over 7 rivers and 7 mountains. In those days, the Eldar became full grown in stature of body and of mind, and the Noldor advanced ever in skill and knowledge. And the long years were filled with their joyful labors, in which many new things fair and wonderful were devised. Then it was that the Noldor first bethought them of letters, and Rumil of Tirion was the name of the lore master who first achieved fitting signs for the recording of speech and song, some for engraving upon metal or in stone, and others for drawing with brush or pen, so he invents writing. And in that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king of Tirion upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë, and the most beloved of the sons of Finwë, which is important because Feanor doesn't do good things ultimately. He's led astray. Curufinwe was his name, but by his mother he was called Feanor, spirit of fire. So his name is Fire Spirit, as his mother calls him. And thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. Now this is the guy who goes on to to craft the Silmarils, and he is Fire Spirit somehow. So he's among the elves, the one who's the the most craftsy. He makes things. But what do you think about this? So I know, Mr. Last, you've got a lot of things to say about this, but I just want to set that up as a conversation starter and say, so he's the spirit of fire. He's intense, and we'll see as a character, his character develops in good and problematic ways. But what we're about to hear in terms of what immediately follows next in the narrative is how his mother is absolutely spent and perishes from the land of the living, just through the sheer strength that it takes to give birth to him, to grow him in her womb and give birth to him. What is the connection here in this? Because Tolkien spends a lot of attention on this, that he himself is, I mean, Feanor himself is crafted of fire in the same way that he crafts, similarly, I should say, to the way he crafts the Silmarils. And we're given a little bit of context about his relationship with the Silmarils, but would we see perhaps as a parallel or a further articulation of what, because heretofore we've been really spending a lot of time with the Valar, and it's almost like we're kind of repeating the verse again, but now in the context of the elves, it seems to me.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I always like to think of this story as most of this prior has been exposition. And it's the world of the normal in that circle of the hero's journey. It's the normal world for the elves. We're really getting to the point of the catalyst where where something is introduced that causes this tension, this mounting tension. I mean, you can't have a really good story without some form of conflict. I mean, conflict is the thing that really drives the narrative. And we're going to be getting into the narrative out of the world of the normal, out of the world of exposition, due to the conflict that's going to occur. And what we see here with Feanor as the spirit of fire is we see a character who's very much like a Prometheus character in Greek mythology, you know, somebody who steals fire from the gods. He isn't the same thing, obviously, because Tolkien's not doing an allegory, but it's very similar to that character. But we also see, because of the element of fire, we see, or should see, an immediate connection to other fire spirits, for lack of a better word, that show up in Tolkien's world. So, for instance, he's like the Balrog, who is fire wrapped in darkness. He is like Sauron, who is himself associated with fire and the whole forging of the ring in the fires of Aragorn. He is even, to some degree, like Melkor, because Melkor himself is likened to the Luciferian character, the bearer of the fire, the fetters lucis, the Luciferian character, who is dissatisfied with his situation and goes out into the void in order to find some meaning. When we see him later crafting the Silmarils, we'll comment on this then. The Silmarils are beautiful, it's true, but they're like stars in the night, and so it's almost like he's going to be himself forging his own little universe, his own little night world, a world of dark. And so Feanor himself enters into the world as of the elements, fire and water and earth and air. He enters in as that fire spirit, not as, that sounds kind of like Avatar, the Last Airbender or something. But, he comes in as a fire spirit, and all of that that carries with it, because fire as an element is the element of the intellect. It's not just the Promethean element. It's also the element that is over the heads of the apostles when they have the event of Pentecost. You know, it's often seen as the idea that comes to a person. In modern terms, a light bulb over the head. It's the fire of crafting that we see when we have the crafting in Norse mythology of the ring, you know, that occurs there. Fire is for humans life, and it is technology, and it is art itself. It represents all those different things. But he also has a connection to these, strangely enough, the Greek image of Paris, because in the story of Troy, the wife of Priam, Hecuba, is going to give birth to Paris, and her daughter Cassandra says, she has this dream, Cassandra does, that her mother gives birth to a fire burn, and that it kills her mother. And she goes to try and tell her that this is the dream she had. Nobody believes her, of course, because it's Cassandra and she's cursed. But of course, it comes true, because Paris ends up being the guy who destroys the city by taking Helen of Troy back to the city. But he is in some ways the Greek vision of the artsy craftsy spooky type. You know, he's got the man bun, and he's got the pad with the perfume and the zebra hides everywhere, and he's smooth and women love him. You know, he's got the pecs. He's like Brad Pitt on crack, you know. But he is a firebrand. You know, he's an image of fire and flame that's going to destroy everything. So Feanor, really, I mean, as a name, it's a great name, because this is the main. We don't have a whole story about, say, his brothers. You know, we don't have a story about Fingolfin or about Finarfin. We don't. It's not where the story carries us. And as a matter of fact, it's not where anything in the rest of the corpus carries us. We see characters like Galadriel, who was she was the daughter of Finarfin, I think. If that's right? Again, forgive me for not getting the tree right, but she's the daughter of Finarfin, and of course she shows up later in the stories. But we don't get any stories about, say, the line of Finarfin necessarily. That's not the main thrust of what we see in Silmarillion or in Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit. What we see
characters are mentioned here and there, but it's not a driving plot line.
Right. The driving thing is whatever it is that Feanor represents and whatever it is that he chooses to do. Not just the crafting, but then later the oath and the kinslaying and the flight and all those other things. Because all of that is like it's a type that I think Tolkien is working out, but I think it's a type that human beings work out as well. And here's my what do they call it? Peroration, right? I'm going to say peristalsis, but that's not right. My peroration. My peroration is that I think that human beings, as a race, we have a problem with our art. We have a problem with creating art. We love the art that we create, and we do it incessantly. And really, culture is based on art much more than even technology. It's based on the capturing of images and capturing of ideas. But we have a very hard time once we have created that art of letting the art go, of stepping away and saying, okay, it's just ink on a page, stepping away and say, oh, it's oil painting on canvas, and just leaving it and leaving it behind. In fact, there's a line that Gandalf just said in Lord of the Rings, which I'm going through again, and he says something to the effect of one who cannot give away a valuable piece of art when it's necessary is not a free person, it's not a free man. I'll find the quote later, but it's something like that. It's key.
And in fact, I think that is the central theme. And we've kind of alluded to this in our previous episodes too. That question, the problem of art is problem, not that art is problematic, but it's a challenge for us. I think more and more I look at it, I believe it is central to what Tolkien is trying to work out. And just as another example, you've got in Gondolin, which will feature prominently later on in this particular story, Turgon, who founded Gondolin, is told explicitly, love not overmuch the work of your own hand.
Yes.
Like it too shall perish,
Yeah.
But that's an interesting thing because it's Feanor, and I just want to add to this a bit. Feanor who drives the plot forward, and it's his sons who then drive the plot forward. Really, in many ways, I could see somebody saying, I don't know about that, Mr. Master, because we've got Luthien and Beren and Luthien, and they can go and snatch the Silmaril from Melkor. Like Feanor kind of takes a side seat as we go on through the Silmarillion. It's his sons, they're a problem, but they're on the margins. The real plot kind of shifts elsewhere. But I think be that as it may on the surface, like deep down, really what's driving the plot, and the reason the title of the whole work is called the Silmarillion is that it's the Silmarils that drive the plot, right? I mean, because Feanor essentially puts all of his everything he is into the creation of the Silmarils. And so then the Silmarils take on that spirit, and they become the focal points of moving the plot, even into Lord of the Rings. They become really this pivotal thing, moving it from the fact that one of the Silmarils, as we know, ends up on the brow of Eärendil, who becomes that star. And that's a continual reference or repeated reference point throughout the Lord of the Rings, down to Elisar, Aragorn himself, being, in addition to being a descendant of one of the bearers of the Silmarils, is defined primarily by the fact he bears this green gem, which has all the allusions to being somehow derivative from one of the Silmarils. There's sort of partial manuscript traditions in the whole corpus that indicate very, very suggestive indications that it is somehow related to or derived from the Silmarils. And as we've mentioned in our previous series on The Hobbit, in fact, that the Arkenstone found under the mountain could in many ways be itself a sub-geothermal derivative crystal of the Silmaril that's cast ultimately down into the fire.
Yeah,
And so you see,
if not in plot, then it's definitely it's related to it in symbolic
the
world.
symbol, exactly.
Yeah, and to that end, you're right, and we have the story of Turanbar and other stories that are in this volume, and we have to acknowledge this is a collected volume. This is not. I mean, Tolkien was working on it, but he didn't say,
Right.
okay, this is the start, this is the finish. So we have to acknowledge that.
Exactly
But nevertheless,
right. And the Silmarillion, for a reminder for everybody, the Silmarillion, as you might buy it off the shelf, is this collection of various tales, one of which is the Silmarillion proper. There's also the Ainulindale and these other stories as well.
Yeah, but nevertheless, I think there's a thematic thing going on here, which is consistent throughout all of these works of Tolkien. And one of the things I think that is so good about that he speaks to is he seems to always be dealing with this struggle of our response to a problem, and he says that in the letter about the problem with I forget the phrase, dissolution, death, and the machine, and our response to the machine, basically. What's the phrase that he says in his letter? I forget what it is.
Mortality anyway, fall in the machine.
Yeah, mortality fall in the machine. That's right. Right. Our response to mortality and our fall from grace in trying to respond to it, and then the machine that we create in order to try and respond to it. I think that art is significantly in that little problem phrase of mortality fall in the machine. Art is, I don't think he's saying that art is bad, that art's a bad thing, but it is certainly problematic. Art is problematic in the sense that when one starts to create art, you run into the risk of creating encouraging things and beautiful things that people can love, but also having the power to create things that can manipulate and can alter people to do your bidding and can dominate other minds through that artwork. But you also run the risk of not being able to tell the difference between the art and the reality anymore, too. The art can be so good or so convincing, the illusion can be so fine that you misconstrue the art for the thing. And this happens all the time, like with actors. I mean, fans of a movie conflate the character with the actor constantly, and the actors complain about this, right? Which my response would be, yeah, right. I know Leonard Nimoy. There's nothing but this his entire life. But at the same time, I say, Jack, you got into it. This was the risk you were running. And then there's some actors who actually believe their own BS too. They start to believe that they are actually Indiana Jones or whatever it is. I don't think that risk should preclude people making art at all, because again, I don't think art's a bad thing. I don't think Tolkien would say art's a bad thing. What I think he would say is that art is itself, to some degree, a response to our condition as humans, to the mortality that we all have to deal with.
That's exactly right. In fact, I just found that quote from letter 131, where he says just that mortality affects art and the creative desire, which seems to have no biological function, this desire to create art, right? There's no biological function tied to it, and is apart from the satisfactions of plain ordinary biological life, with which in our world it is indeed often at strife. The desire to create art and the needs of daily life, like get a job, go to work, earn money.
Yeah, right.
This creative desire is at once wedded to a passionate love of the real primary world, and hence filled with the sense of mortality, and yet unsatisfied by it. It has various opportunities of, and he puts capital letters and scare quotes, opportunities of fall. It may become possessive, clinging to the things made as its own. The sub-creator wishes to be the Lord and God of his private creation. He will rebel against the laws of the creator, capital C, especially against mortality. Right. So art and the creation of art is a beautiful and good thing, a natural but not a biological desire in us to create this and to love the beautiful. But as such is also a precipice with a great risk of falling, of another fall, to fall from our higher level to a lower level.
Yes, and I think that he really embodies that in this phrase that he uses earlier in chapter 5, He's talking about the elves, but he's also talking about humans. Uh,
Mhm.
where the elves, it says, even in those blessed realms, they have this longing in them, this constant longing. John Tavener, the modern composer, said that's where music really comes from. Music comes from this, he calls it eros. It's a desire, a longing for this
A
land that
yearning.
we've been exiled from.
Yeah.
Tolkien talks about it. The phrase is, even among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, they long to still at times to see the stars. And you can't get much more beautiful than a land that's like California in its original form. The radiant flowers, the California, it is beautiful and lush, and it's lit by these glowing trees, and you've got the deathless gods there walking among you and conversing. How could it be any better? But even in the midst of that, the elves are like, yeah, this is wonderful. I miss the stars. There's this longing for
Mhm.
this strange longing, and I think that that's kind of the fountain of art for them, the fountain of creation for them, and that's when you create a thing, a piece of artwork, a drawing or a song or one of the plastic arts, and it's perfect, and it's just the ideal thing, whatever, the little turtle or whatever. Like that's just so perfect, and it's created, but it's also part of the world. It's now part of the natural
Mhm.
world because you brought it into being, and you don't want it to die. You don't want it to be sacrificed. You don't want it to be destroyed. Some idiot come along and like throw a pie at the Mona Lisa. You don't want that. Um,
Mhm.
and so you end up defending these artworks, either of other people or even worse, of your own artwork. You defend them at the risk of violence or at the risk of your own demise. Which, okay, folks, name me one other animal in the world that does that. No,
Mhm.
there is none. There is no. I mean, monkeys don't create something out of like poo or out of mud and then like beat each other up over it. They'll fight over females or over food or over territory, or sometimes they even fight because they get pissed off. It's true, but they don't go and make like a little macrame thing, and then suddenly like love this piece of macrame that they've made and kill each other over. They don't do that. Humans do. To be honest, it's very strange. It's very weird. And I think that's what he's probing here in some degree. How weird this is.
It's got to be because it's something that it is weird because somehow man has this sub-creative capacity, and this is something that Tolkien meditated a lot upon in his prose works, and of course he grapples expressly with this issue in Leaf by Niggle, a very different kind of
Yeah.
story, but it's the problem of the creator, the artist, but it is a strange thing, and this is why in so many different, and I'm right now most familiar in terms of what is closest to my in my memory at hand to retrieve is in ancient Near Eastern mythology, um, across the board from Babylon to the Levant, is the arts and the sciences, so writing, metallurgy, painting, jewelry, all of this, sometimes even language and music, are given by the gods. Like there's
Mm.
no notion that this is something that man discovers, but something that is received from on high because it's somehow part of the divine nature that man is brought up into. And we see this here actually very explicitly in what follows, with Feanor being, some say Feanor was instructed by Melkor specifically, but the authors, the narrator says this is pish posh. He was driven by his own heart. He wouldn't accept advice even from one of the gods. To his own condemnation. He's that sense of his own self-esteem, both for good and for evil, is there. But the idea that the the Noldor, and we see the Noldor learn at this point various things from Melkor, or at least Feanor discuss. He learns this. They're connected with Aule. In fact, Feanor's father-in-law is most beloved of Aule among all the Noldor. He's the one who's
Mm.
most beloved of Aule and has learned a lot of smithcraft from him. And Feanor's connected in that way, and they learn from the Valar various crafts and skills. But they also then Melkor, as we'll see, insinuates his way in and sort of starts to deceive Feanor once Feanor has created these things, because Morgoth lusts after them. I mean, think about that. What that must do for your ego is that you created a thing that even the devil is jealous of. You know, it's like Mephistopheles shows up and says, "Hey, actually, what do you got for me? Can I have one of those?" You know.
Yeah. Devil went down to Georgia and he was looking for a soul to steal. He was in a bind. He was way behind. He was willing to make a deal.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's classic right there. You're absolutely right.
Right.
Absolutely right. It's interesting though. I'm sorry, you're going to complete the thought, but
yeah, I was just going to say that this notion that it's a two-edged sword, though, that these arts, these crafts. So in various of the ancient Syriac and Hebrew creation stories, or early generations stories, let's say, where man is given, such and such, the gods or angels or something in between, gave music, and the making of brass instruments is both for making music and for making weapons to kill and dismember one another. And that the music itself, I'm thinking particularly of a work that I've been studying in depth, the Cave of Treasures. Is it talks about music as being music is both a beautiful thing and used to praise God and the glories of creation, but also intimately connected with perversity and idolatry and all sorts of immoral behavior, slaughtering one another. Somehow that's like the music is also connected with fornication and slaughtering each other, and the beauty of creation, because obviously the birds sing. In many ways, the language of birds, and Solomon speaks, is music, right? I mean, that's and so it's somehow it's both. And in these ancient tales, the giving of this kind of technique, this know-how, the craft, is both a curse, and that's where all evils came from, and at the same time, the blessing, and that's where all the beautiful things came from. And it's this morally ambiguous space that I think the modern reader of some of these ancient tales, and if anyone dives into some of those more boring chapters in Genesis, can get really lost in, because look, is it good or is it bad? And there are whole groups of people that have defined, okay, music is bad, dancing shall not be done, right? And it's all bad because they can't weave through the thicket of this moral ambiguity of the thing. And I think that's like something that we see here.
Yeah, it is very much like that. I mean, the Joshua in front of Jericho uses music to destroy the walls of Jericho.
You're right.
But then you get the David dancing in front of the ark to music. And you get Salome dancing in front of Herod. That music there too. It is interesting. It is a double-edged thing. I think any artist who's crafted something has to grapple with this. If you're very good at drawing landscapes and human forms, you also have the potential for drawing nasty pictures. Frank Frazetta type buff naked women things. It's
right.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. It is interesting too that you brought up the gods giving these gifts to humans. I mean, every culture has that to some degree. It seems like that Odin discovers the runes, or the muses themselves come down, govern over the various different muses. Or you have the giving of Prometheus' fire to men. You have those images of the gods giving these things, and they do here too. But there is something I did notice that for letters, the elves discover those on their own. That's kind of striking to me. They don't actually have a god come down and say, "Here are letters for you." This passage that you read here, it says, the Noldor first bethought them of letters. They don't have a god telling them. Rumiel of Tirion was the name of the lore master who first achieved fitting signs for recording speech and song.
Achieved it, yeah.
Yeah, achieved it. It's like letters are the symbolic capturing of sounds and words is something which is a craft developed by mortals rather than given by immortals to mortals, which is a unique.
Semiology is uniquely human in this particular accounting, which is interesting, and it's something that we're told in the next page that Rumiel invented it, but Feanor made it better. In his youth, he bettered the work of Rumiel and devised now the letters which bear his name. But you're
Yes.
right. That's interesting that language, and this of course is key for I don't know, like, Tolkien's a philologist.
Mm.
That semiology is something derived just from the elves. Now, and as we're saying, when we say elves, as you mentioned before, this is a standard for human beings. Right? At this point in the narrative, as we get later in the plot, they'll meet human beings, and they actually give language. The strong
Yes.
implication is that man is
Yes.
incapable of language yet until the elves teach them to speak and to think.
Yeah.
And that's from where we derive that capacity ourselves.
Yeah.
But that
And
is
runes.
interesting. Yeah, that runes specifically, carven runes and the more flowy written
Mm-hmm.
runes, letters, are both devised by Rumil and then modified by Feanor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting to me too that his mother is very good at craft herself. She's an
Mm-hmm.
artist with the loom, and
That's right.
she captures beauty in that weaving and needlework, which is again a remarkable craft. One of the seminal crafts of human culture. That
Mm-hmm.
as much as language and the crafting of words is seminal to human culture, so too is this art of weaving things, because you take what's natural and you make
Actually,
it, I don't know, not unnatural, but a new natural thing you introduce to the world.
right. And I think, it's very interesting with like weaving and needlecraft is you're taking disparate things
Yes,
and bringing them into a unity,
right,
right?
right.
It's beautifully depicted in that. Oh, what is her name? The enchantress lady who sees Lancelot riding across the plain behind her. The post Raphael or the pre Raphael Brotherhood painting. There's a couple of
Oh,
different. A couple of them tackle this, and I can't think of her name. I can't think of her name.
that stumped me.
But she's weaving this, and you see that. Then that's the craft of weaving. Disparate threads. I mean, from fibers being spun into threads being drawn together and well
Yeah,
woven together to create a
which,
whole, a unity. Whereas writing, actually, when you think about the process of writing, you're taking things that are, in one sense, a whole, a unity, sounds, right? We don't hear sounds as letters, we hear sounds as they are. And writing, in some ways, takes the sounds and freezes them into these different symbols on a
mhm,
page or whatever
mhm,
your medium is. And almost is as though you're taking a whole and turning it into little bits and bytes
mhm.
and megabytes or to write out.
Yes,
But at the
yes,
same time, it's almost because you're capturing it all in one physical place, you're taking something that is very ephemeral, the spoken word, which is gone as soon as it's uttered, and making it permanent
yes.
across time and space, and thereby giving it a different kind of wholeness. So it's
Yeah.
writing itself kind of goes both directions. Um,
But we also have the thing that you brought up before, which is a spell is
mhm.
woven, and that when we craft anything in words, we are taking disparate elements and weaving them together. I mean, we've talked about this here in this work, how he draws from different sources, and this has this parallel to that and that connection to that. Because I think that
Mhm.
when you're even working with words or with written words, you are weaving together things. Even the very fact that as a single letter, a single letter represents a sound, but when you put letters together, you capture something more than a sound. It's actually a concept. So B
Mhm.
is just a sound. Bear together captures whatever that creature is that's coming at you. And so
The
we
or.
preserve that. Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you're with words, there's a certain element of weaving things together too,
It
that you
is
create something
exactly
new.
right.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting.
That's a
So
really
his
cool
mom
point
is
because
that, and
yeah,
she only bears that one great child,
right.
brings
And
one
all
child
this
into the world.
strength and energy that would have gone into multiple children all goes into Feanor. It's a way of saying Feanor is worth, 10 men. It's like he's
Yeah,
literally got
well,
all
it
that you
is.
put into like 10 different people
This
in
is
one
also
guy.
startling though, because uh, the Latin word for womb is matrix, and matrix is also a term that's used for the coordination of words or the coordination of ideas. So the concept being that a human being is formed in the womb in some ways like a concept or an equation is framed in the matrix, which itself, matrix was a localized vision of the logos in the ancient world. I hate to keep going back to this. I feel like little Johnny One Note, right? But the logos was the term that was used for that overarching plan or idiom or pattern. Matrix was the localized vision of it. So, for instance, you might say the matrix, the logos is all the numbers. The matrix is the Fibonacci series, a single series of numbers in a certain type of order, which is part of the logos, but it's a matrix. And out of that matrix then comes these things like architecture and artwork and painting. So in a way, Feanor emerges out of the matrix of his mother, and then he does these things in the world. Now I don't know, maybe Tolkien wasn't thinking of any of that, but if he wasn't thinking about it, then he sure as hell has a great intuitive ability to capture this concept. The story becomes something he discovers rather than invents, which he often said. So, all right, so let's get to Feanor.
Yeah, so Feanor, and it's one other aspect here is we'll revisit in more detail when we see her, but Feanor's, I suppose it makes his niece, right? Because she's in the house of Finwë. No, I get the names messed up, but Galadriel. Right, so we've got Galadriel as a figure. So what we'll see Feanor do is capture the light of the trees into the Silmarils, whereas Galadriel doesn't. She also captures the light of the trees, but not through any craft of her own, but by her very nature. Her hair is imbued with the light of the trees, the silver and gold. Yeah. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we look at Feanor, and then what we'll see later with Galadriel, as that's explicitly spelled out, but keeping that in mind already ahead of time. So Feanor is here, and there's really a sad story about Miriel, but we don't have time to delve into it. But it should give us pause. Somehow her spirit, even in the blessed realm, she lays down to rest in the forest or the gardens of Lorien, which is a place of dreams and healing. If you remember from previous episode on the Valar, and that her spirit goes down to the halls of Mandos for some reason, and we don't know. And somehow she's kept as a type of the sleeping person. The king sleeping, the sleeping king who shall rise again, sleeping Father Time, sleeping princess, what have you. She's of that type now, and she's sleeping in Lorien, and her body is kept by the attendants of the gods, essentially. But Feanor,
is that how elves die, though? Is that how elves die, generally speaking?
But they don't, though. They don't die. I mean, they can be killed. Usually they just go to the blessed realm. So here's somebody who's in the blessed realm, and she lays down to sleep, and seeming though to be sleeping, her spirit departed in truth to the halls of Mandos. As far as we know, that hasn't happened to any. We don't know of that happening to any other elf. So this is a unique, still in that mythic realm level. Like this, that's what this chapter is very interesting, because as its place in the work, it kind of itself dwells between, like it flows between sort of this fey realm and the more conventional world. It was really interesting. It's like dwelling in the starlight. So Feanor becomes the most subtle in mind, and the most skilled in hand. He improves on the writing system, as we mentioned, and the first gems. He discovered how gems, greater and brighter than those of the earth, might be made with skill. So we know that there are gems made of, or you find gems. You can find gems. Best of all, the pearls, right, that require admit of no handcraft. You try to chisel a pearl and it crumbles. But you might find diamonds and rubies in the earth. And Feanor decides, not only you can take gems and then chisel them and polish them, make facets, make gems, jewels out of them. When he finds gems, he begins to make gems. And think about that. He's making things, making jewels themselves. And that's very different than the ordinary craft of a jeweler, right? The first gems that Feanor made were white and colorless, but being set under starlight, they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than hell. And other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen, small but clear, as with the eyes of eagles of Manwë. Seldom were the hands and mind of Feanor at rest. So he's a great technician in that way, right? He developed essentially binoculars and spyglasses and so on. While still early in his youth, he weds Nerdanel, who's daughter of the great smith Mahtan, who's most dear to Aule, and he learned much of making things in metal and stone from his father-in-law. His wife, Nerdanel, was also firm of will, but more patient than Feanor, desiring rather to understand minds than to master them. So that implies Feanor would just as soon master other people than understand them, right? Which shows exactly, shows a distinction with art and with writing, especially it says writing. If I write to communicate and open paths of communication so we can understand one another, to commune, right, to become one together, it's very different than if I write in order to control other people. Right? The one is, I don't know, literature and communication. The other very quickly becomes propaganda.
Yes. But it's something I just don't understand this. Is there some pleasure that there must be some pleasure that people take in not just having people look up to you or emulate you or say you're great, but in having people ready to do your will. There must be something strangely desirable in that. I honestly don't understand it. And that's just me. Maybe I've never had anybody want to do my will. I don't know.
You're too good, Mr.
I'm too good. I don't know. But it's a strange thing. This is what seems to be Tolkien is talking about, that Feanor has this desire to have other people ready to do his bidding, ready to be dominated. That's very strange to me. I never thought of that before.
Now, here's another interesting thing related to that. Then, though, is back to this notion of things that are both good and the moral ambiguity of certain actions. So, Finwë takes as a second wife Indis the Fair. She was Vanya, close king of Ingwe, the High King, golden-haired and tall, in all ways unlike Miriel. Miriel was dark, right? Finwë loved her greatly and was glad again, but he never forgot Miriel, right? Here's an interesting thing. The wedding of his father to Indis now was not pleasing to Feanor, and he had no great love for Indis, nor Fingolfin or Finarfin, her sons. So we're introduced right away. So Finwë, the only elf in the Blessed Realm who's sad, right? The only sad elf in the Blessed Realm, remarries in order to find joy. And it's a beautiful thing. We're told, oh, it's wonderful. And Fingolfin and Finarfin. And if it weren't for them, we're told, if it weren't for Indis, and the children of Indis were great and glorious, and their children after them also. If they had not lived, the history of the Eldar would have been diminished. And on the flip side of that, we're told that this essentially caused a fissure within the house of Finwë, right? Feanor on the one hand, and Fingolfin and Finarfin on the other. And those unhappy things which later come to pass, we'll hear about over the coming episodes, in which Feanor was the leader. There are many who saw the effect of this break in the house of Finwë, judging that if Finwë had endured his loss and been content with the fathering of Feanor, the curses of Feanor would have been otherwise, and great evil might have been the courses of Feanor, I should say, would have been otherwise. Great evil might have been prevented. So had he not gotten remarried, and even though great good came out of it, perhaps Feanor wouldn't have gone the way that he did, and maybe the sons of Feanor wouldn't have essentially brought genocide and terror upon the earth for 1,000 years. That's what it comes down to. But who knows?
It's quite intriguing. It's quite intriguing. First off, it's intriguing because this would have happened all the time in ancient houses, these powerful houses. And even now, you don't have to be an ancient, powerful house. It could be just like, the local trailer park.
Street.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
When you get remarried and you have kids, there's this strange thing that happens where there is this like division between the different groupings, so to speak. And in an ancient house, a powerful house like the house of Finwë, it would have been quite tremendous. It would have had a great effect on everybody else because he would have had so many subordinates. But all of this is occurring, or seems to be occurring, before Melkor is even reintroduced to the scene. In other words, this is not the effect of Melkor. This is the effect of the nature of Feanor. That's kind of startling.
Exactly.
Let me go back with just
right. There's
one
no dark
ask your opinion.
Shadow over his shoulders saying, do this, do that.
Right. Let me ask your opinion on this. You mentioned earlier where he said, he talks about making crystals wherein things far away could be seen small but clear as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. And you had mentioned that was a sort of techne rather than on ours. But it really reminds me of what we see later in the I don't know what's the name of it. The seeing stones of Numenor that appear in the Lord of the Rings. The Palantir. There we go. Yes. Is this a precursor, perhaps, to that, or a
I think it's
prototype?
the beta version of that same.
The beta version. Yeah. Huh. Interesting. As far back as all this, too.
As far back as before the creation of the Silmarils, he had a side project working on these things, and then and they get to pick it up later.
Yeah.
But let's move ahead to so we mentioned Melkor. Melkor gets loose somehow. Why? He doesn't break out, but he appeals to the Valar, says, I've converted, I've seen the light, I've repented, and I'm going to turn over a new leaf.
I don't understand this. I honestly don't understand it. I don't understand it. I mean, maybe we should just start with reading the passage, because I don't understand. It even says in the text, the noontide of Valinor was drawing to its
close. Which, just to frame, like, that phrase is so significant, especially because it precedes the mention of Melkor. For it came to pass that Melkor, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
The noontide of Valinor was drawing to its close. Says that there's some higher law at work. There's a higher Tao in place than just the will of Melkor. Melkor is not a mover of things. He too is moved. Yeah. Because remember, all of this is part of a great song that has already been sung. They've now entered into the music. And so it's the workings of providence in some way are moving things along. So the noontide Valinor is drawing to its close, and now Melkor is let out of his time out. For it came to pass that Melkor, as the Valar had decreed, past perfect, completed his term, the term of his bondage, dwelling for 3 ages in the duress of Mandos alone. At length, as Manwë had promised, he was brought again before the thrones of the Valar. Then he looked upon the glory and their bliss, and envy was in his heart. He looked upon the children of Ilúvatar, that's the elves, that sat at the feet of the mighty, and hatred filled him. He looked upon the wealth of bright gems, and he lusted for them. But he hid his thoughts and postponed his vengeance. So I guess as he's on his way to his parole, to his his trial, whatever, his parole officers, he sees these things, and he's filled with envy, he's filled with hate, he's filled with lust, desire, right? And before the gates of Valmar, Melkor abased himself at the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon, vowing that if he had made only the least of the free people of Valinor, if he might be made only the least of the free people of Valinor, he would aid the Valar in all their works, and most of all in the healing of the many hurts that he had done. And Nienna aided his prayer. Oh, no, we should let him go. But Mandos was silent. Like the guardian of death, Hades himself, is sitting watching. Like, I've been with this guy for 3 ages. I don't think anything's changed, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't say anything because he's deaf. What can death say? He just shows up. But Manwë granted him pardon, but the Valar would not suffer him yet to depart beyond their sight and vigilance. So he's granted parole. You promise you won't leave the state? No, officer, of course. I wouldn't dream of leaving the state. Go hop on an airplane. Sure. Off you're going.
Yeah, and first off, it's intriguing that Nienna, she's sort of the bleeding heart type here. She's like, let it go. But she's also paralleled with Ulmo. She's the one that's described. She's this character here that I'll put this up in a minute, but she's the one that dwells alone It says, and earlier, she's acquainted with grief and mourns for every wound that Arda has suffered in the marring of Melkor. So she grieves for all the wounds that Melkor has caused. But she weeps, as it says, not for herself, but for those who hearken to learn pity and endurance and hope. So she's really weeping for the suffering of everybody. So she's the perfect candidate to say, Melkor, he suffered terribly. I understand his pain.
Right. That's interesting. You mentioned that parallel. Interesting you mentioned the parallel with Ulmo, because we're told why Manwë goes along with it. His Manwë was free from evil and could not comprehend it.
Yeah.
And he knew that in the beginning, the thought of Iluvatar, Melkor had been even as they had been essentially brothers. Right? And so, but evil is so foreign to Manwë that he can't conceive of really what it is. It's okay. If Melkor says he's better, I guess he's better. I don't, somehow. But it says Ulmo was not deceived.
Yeah.
Why, and so why is Ulmo not deceived? Somehow, and we're told that Ulmo has, like elsewhere, we've seen Manwë's got the deepest connection. He's got the pipeline to the thoughts of the Iluvatar. But Ulmo somehow has like a back door. He's got access to the archives that even Manwë doesn't see.
Yeah, well, the very deep thing, right? The
deep thing,
deep and all that. Maybe that's what it is.
I think that's the thing. He is the waters.
Yeah, and I think the waters remember more than the land does in a way.
Right.
I think that the whole thing with Manwë is, I know you have to have something to move the plot along, technically, but I just can't get over this thing that Manwë is supposed to be the wisest and the closest to Iluvatar. Understands the things that are supposed to happen. He thinks he's deceived. He thinks that everything's going to be okay. And it's like, Manwë, dude, come on. Didn't you see the last several hundred years?
So even Manwë, closest to Iluvatar, is not Iluvatar himself. So he has characteristics of Iluvatar: creation, goodness, mercy, but he's not omniscient like Iluvatar is. I think it's an interesting thing. Manwë knows what must move things along, and this is perhaps then part of the song. Even the releasing of Melkor is part of the song that's already been sung.
Right. And I see that.
And so it's a thing that must happen, right? But
yeah. But even that's kind of strange because, think about this for a minute. This is why I think about Boethius and his struggle with predestination there in the Constellation of Philosophy. The song was marred by Melkor, whose sinister tones were set in place and then recalibrated, and then occurred again and set in place, and then recalibrated, and then occurred a third time. So it's Melkor who's singing all the dissonance. Well, that dissonance comes true in the history of the world. But now Melkor, who sang the song, is part of the history of the world. So he is on the one hand doing the evil, but he's also already sung the evil that he is going to do that's set down for him. That's a little, I don't know, I'm confused.
It's a little...
That gives Tolkien, but kind of confused at how this, if Melkor sang the song and was chastised for it, on the one hand, maybe you might say, yeah, I shouldn't actually do this stuff. I just sang it. But if he sang and all the rest of the choir was like, dude, come on. It's B flat. Then why in real life would they be like, oh, he's fine. Let's just let him go?
Because it's not like we're tempted to think of it that they sang it all first and then they go on stage and they act it out. But it's they sing it and then they go back into the song. That's already been like the song is somehow it's like a house that you built and now you go in and I don't know, that's not quite right. But somehow they create the song and then they enter into the song. It's not a repeat, right? Because they did the singing of the song outside of time and now they've entered into it. That's already been sung. And so he's not doing it again. He's just doing it out in person.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. He's just doing it in a physical world, whereas before it was a thing he sang from outside.
Do we run the risk then? But do we run the risk then of fatalism?
If if it were all predetermined, but it's not predetermined. It's his act of doing now in this state, because it's layered states of being, not sequential events. So the first pass in the Ainu Lindule is the singing of it at the high level. And now we get the lower level in the physical world, the acting out of these things, the physical articulation of what's being sung. So even as we read through this story right here, it is currently being sung at the level of Ainu Lindale. Which, if you think about it, means that the act of creation is happening right now. So God speaking the word of creation happens right now, as we're living in the physical articulation of it in this world, which is this traditional, ancient conception of how these things relate to each other.
Yeah, that's why I brought up Boethius, because if you haven't, I know you have, but if the audience has not read Boethius, I mean, the constellation philosophy brings up this very difficult problem. How do you deal with your own free will and the results of your own free will, if everything's already predetermined, like in the mind of God? You know, he's already set it down, he foresees the future, but he doesn't change it at all. And Boethius then solves the problem by saying everything in the mind of God is in the eternal now. And we live in time. We are trapped in time, and we exercise our free will within time. But for God, it's all the eternal. There is no future and past in the mind of God. It's all the eternal now. That's very difficult to get the mind around. And I think there's something similar going on here in this story, where Tolkien is creating that eternal vision, if you will, in the LOTR, which manifests in the eternal song pattern, which then manifests in the actual history of the universe. A very platonic, if you will, repetition of forms, of what they call in geometry a gnomic expansion of things into the world, manifestation. And all of it, to be honest, all of it seems to be an attempt to understand why there's evil at all, right? Because the question is classic theological question. If God is good, why is there evil? And if there is no good, then, you know, is there a God at all? You know, that's a classic question. Either the world is good, or the world is godless and bad. That's very tricky. Very tricky, I think. Same thing here.
Exactly. And I think, it's interesting where it ends here. Is actually, it ends in a very mundane, quotidian sort of thing, the very ending of the chapter. But the sort of the conclusion, the nice resolution of the chapter is that in his heart, so Melkor's been loosed now in a tame way. In his heart, he hated the Eldar because they were fair and joyful, and because he saw the reason for the rising of the Valar and his own downfall. So seeing the elves, he's like, I get it now. Why the Valar all of a sudden came and got him was because of these guys, right? And so he's got a specific hatred for the Eldar. But he feigned love and sought their friendship, and he offered them service of his lore and labor in any great deed that they would do. But the Vanyar held him in suspicion, for they dwelt in the light of the trees, and they didn't need anything more. The Teleri, who dwell outside of the Valinor, right? They dwell on the shores or in their own little island out there. He didn't pay any attention to them, thinking them little worth is too weak for his designs. They just love the stars. It's like, I'm not going to do anything with you hippies. But the Noldor took delight in the hidden knowledge that he could reveal to them. And so some hearkened to his words. Some hearkened to words that it would have been better for them never to have heard. And so what is it that he finds an inn where? Not among the powerful, the brilliant, the illumined, the actually illumined. They dwell in the light of the trees. They're content. They're full. They don't need anything more. He has nothing to offer. They see him, and there's nothing that he can offer them that they don't already have. They feel no need. Then there's those who live in the forests and the hills by the shores of the sea and love the stars. He figures they can do nothing with them. But he goes right at the people who like to create technology, the people who like to create art. We love knowledge, right? We want to learn more. Maybe if I know more, we'll have more power. And actually, this is very interesting that Goethe goes after, starting framework of Faust is Dr. Faustus is sitting down, he's trying to translate the prologue of the Gospel of John. And he's got that line, in archi in ho logos, right? In the beginning was the logos. And I say, well, I don't like this, because logos is a tricky word in Greek to translate it to German, in the case of Goethe's Faust. And he says, well, should we, word? No. Knowledge. Knowledge would be good. Hey, let's make it say knowledge instead. In the beginning was knowledge. Knowledge is the fundament of all things. He said, but why knowledge? Knowledge is, why would I know things? In order to have power over creation, in order to have power over other people. That's what I'll do. Logos. In the beginning was power, which of course the German word for this is Kraft, right?
Wow.
So it's, in the beginning was power, and then poof, that's where Mephistopheles appears, as you call it.
Wow. Wow.
And so it's that I want hidden knowledge. I love learning things, or to pull back to where we've talked recently about the unsung hero of Middle Earth, Smeagol, who loves to delve down into the roots of things. That's that same tendency that we see in the Noldor that becomes the snaring point, right? They want to get down into the roots of things, to know hidden deep down things, as Hopkins says, but also then to craft jewels out of the deep and unite the deep with the deep. To take the things from the minerals from the earth and unite them to the light of the stars to make gems and other beautiful things, which is not an evil undertaking, but perhaps a perilous undertaking.
And also,
you go ahead.
Specifically Feanor, specifically that guy,
exactly.
Who we just
and it does.
saw. He has that tendency to want to dominate.
Yes, and it's a beautifully structured. The beautiful, literary structure of this chapter is it goes in an upside down pyramid, like an inverted pyramid to the very end. Melkor found an inn with the Noldor because they love to know the secret knowledge, and they listen to things they should. Some listen to words they should never have heard. And by the way, Feanor, it very specifically hones in on Feanor. Then, was taken in. But in truth, it says nobody hated Melkor more than Feanor. And he was the first one to call Melkor Morgoth. And snared though he was in the webs of Melkor's malice against the Valar, he had no converse with him and took no counsel from him. He sort of was unwitting powerful rook in the game of Melkor. But Feanor was driven by the fire of his own heart only. So he's the author of his own peril, not Melkor. Melkor simply used it. So Feanor worked ever swiftly and alone. Note that. I think that's an important thing that Tolkien identifies again and again as a problematic move, is that when you isolate yourself, it goes bad, right?
Yeah.
And we're told very mundanely at the end, Feanor asked for the aid and counsel of no one that dwelt in Aman, great or small, save only for a little while the counsel of Nerdanel, his wife, the wise. So Nerdanel the wise was his wife. So he was wedded to the one who is simply known as the wise. His wife is the one who's the wise, and only for a short time did he seek her counsel and wisdom. And then eventually he goes on his own. He sets himself apart, and then bad things happen.
That is a perilous situation indeed. It really is. I mean, you can see the wife being like, "What are you up to, you crazy old man? Feanor, what are you thinking now, you fool?" And she's
quiet, you old woman.
Quiet, woman.
Right.
I'm crafting gems, damn it. she's the one who's able to give him that kind of counsel, but he's put himself in a bad spot if he has shut himself off from everyone but her because, well, she's only mortal, an elf, but she's only mortal. She's only one person, and he's kind of left with this last, I don't know what the word would be, safeguard against becoming this monster, really.
Right.
Right. And it is intriguing too that he's not hearkening, as he says, to the words of Melkor. He doesn't like Melkor, but Melkor is definitely a rival. He becomes almost like a twin to Feanor. And that's something that Tolkien brings up over and over again, this twinning between characters. Melkor and Sauron, and then Saruman and Wormtongue, things like that. Subordinate almost. That hates his master, but loves his master. And stealth things will arise.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Good spot to end on, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir, for this.
Thank you.
Despite both of our being a little depleted, not debilitated, but depleted situation, it was a very good discussion. So farewell wherever you fare to Ares and see you at your journey's end.
May the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails, and the